Hello everybody, welcome to Level Pixel Level. Today I'd just like to show you how I would go about rigging a piston. So if you go to my Gumroad account, I've actually already built the majority of this rig for you. Everything I've done to build this rig I've pretty much covered in other videos, so I just wanted to get right to the piston part of this tutorial. It's a pretty simple rig with these two robotic arms here. There's a small control for the hand and then a couple controls for the fingers as well. And I'm just going to flip to solid mode and I'm going to go to side view. Just talk about what we're going to be doing here. So we're going to add a couple bones here. And there's going to be a bone pointing this way. There's going to be another bone here at this hinge pointing this way. And I'm actually going to use a constraint called damp track to keep these bones pointed at each other even as the main arm moves. We're going to do the same thing over here. The second piston we make is going to be a bit more complicated than the first one, but it's going to share a similar philosophy. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to use my 3D cursor to place my first bone, and I'm just going to exit pose mode and go to object mode. I'm going to select on this piece of geometry right here because it has that cylinder right here. This cylinder right here. What I want is to put the cursor at the very center of that cylinder. So I'm going to enter edit mode. I'm going to turn on show whole scene transparent. And you can see there's that center edge right there. So if I hold Alt on my keyboard and left click, I will select that edge. And what I'm going to do now is hit Shift S, which is a very common hotkey I use all the time, and I'm going to do cursor to selected. So now my cursor is right at that hinge, and I'm going to go back to my rig and add the bone. So I'll select my rig, I'm going to go to edit mode, and just hit Shift A. And it's just going to add a bone to my rig, so I'm just going to select that bone there, and I want to scale it down now. So go to your pivot point and make sure it's on individual origins. And now I can just scale that bone down towards the 3D cursor. Now every bone has a head and a tail, and this is the tail of the bone here. And I want the tail of that bone to basically be pointing right at that cylinder right there. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go back to object mode. I'm going to select this piece of geometry here. I'm going to go to edit mode. I'm going to find that center ring there. I'm just going to hold Alt on my keyboard and click on that ring there. Now I'm going to hit Shift S, cursor to selected. So now that that's there, I'm going to go back to object mode. I'm going to select my rig again, go to edit mode, and I'm going to select the tail of the bone. Now I'm going to hit Shift S, selection to cursor. So now that bone is perfectly along the length of that piston. And what I actually want to do now is duplicate it. So I'm going to go to armature and I'm going to click on duplicate. Now I'm just going to hit escape and that's just going to approve the operation. So now I actually have two bones sitting right on top of each other there. And with the second one selected, I'm going to go to armature, switch direction. So now you see I have two bones sitting in different directions there, and I'm going to select them both, and since my pivot point is still on individual origins, I'm just going to scale them. And they're scaling right to the heads, so they're just staying nice with that pivot and that alignment. And right now I'm just going to parent them up. So this bottom one here, I'm actually going to parent to this bone down here. So I'm going to click on the first one, and I'm going to hold Shift to select the second one, and I'm going to do Control P, keep offset. This one up here, I'm actually going to parent to this bone right here. So again, I'm going to hold Shift, select the second bone, do Control P, keep offset. Now, I'm just going to parent up the piston pieces really quick. So I'm going to go to pose mode, and I'm just going to hit Alt Z, and that just turns off transparency on the rig. It allows you to select the geometry if you want, if you're finding it difficult to select the geometry. So I'm going to select this bottom piston here. I'm going to hold Shift and select the rig again. And make sure you don't actually get the other pipe there. What you might want to do is just select on this control right here. And make sure you have this bone as active. I'm going to do Control P to bone. Then I'll select on this piece up here. Again, I'll select on the rig again, holding shift down. I select that other bone there and I do Control B and I click on bone. If I rotate this control here, you'll see that the two pistons are in fact rigged up and moving. They're just not rotating with the other one yet. So to achieve this, I'm going to use a constraint. I'm going to rename this quickly though to piston bottom 1. And this one I'm going to rename to piston top 1. Now select on piston top 1. And what I actually want to do is create a damped track constraint, which is almost like an orient constraint from Maya to this bone down here. So if you scroll down in your properties panel here and come to this very bottom one here called bone constraint, you'll have this add bone constraint option here. I'm going to click on damp track. Now for target, I'm actually going to type in the name of my rig right now. So piston and piston underscore rig appears. Once you enter an armature into a constraint, a bone option will usually come up after that, which will give you every bone in that rig. So here I'm going to put it to piston bottom underscore 1. Now when I rotate that arm control, it's pointing back towards that other bone and it'll always point there. Now I can't point this bone back to this one. So right now this bone is pointing down to here. And I can't point this one back to here because that's actually going to cause a dependency in my rig. And that's when two constraints are looking at each other and they're essentially getting their information from the bone they came from. So if this one is getting a damp track from this one and this one's going back to this one to get a damp track, it's going to keep calculating and actually cause an issue with the program. There are some really tricky ways around this. We're not going to get into those right now. I just want to show you how I would deal with this. So with this control structure selected, I'm just going to come to viewport display and I'm going to turn off shapes for a second so you can see the underlying rig. I'm actually going to damp track this bone to this bone here. Let me just make that color a little brighter. So it's actually going to damp track to this bone right here, that main controller on the arm. And that controller name is arm.001. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to go add bone constraint, damp track. I'm going to type in rig again, piston rig. As soon as I do, I get that bone option here. Here I'm going to type in arm and arm.001 appears. Now this bone has pointed to the head of the bone here, but I actually want it to point up at the tail of the bone, which is perfect that every constraint, for the most part, has this head-tail switch here, which I can now drive to 1 and it will point to the tail of that bone. So now when I rotate it, I get this really nice piston action here. So I'll select on my rig and I'm going to turn shapes back on. Now when I rotate this, I am getting that piston to work correctly. Let's rig up this one as well. So I'm going to use the same technique. I'm going to select this piece of geometry here. I'm going to hit tab to go to edit mode. I'm just going to turn on transparency and I'll hold Alt to select that middle ring. I'll hit Shift S, cursor to selected. I'll go back to my rig and I'll go to edit mode and I'll hit Shift A and I add a bone there. So I'll just select it and I'm just going to scale it down. Now I want to point it up to the arm here, and there's another nice cylinder pivot up there, so I'm going to hit tab and I'm going to hold Alt and I'll select that middle ring there. I'll hit Shift S, cursor to selected. Same thing, I'm going to hit tab to exit edit mode. I'll select on my rig again. I'm going to go back to edit mode. I'll select on the tail of the bone, I'll hit Shift S, selection to cursor. So now I have that one there, it's nicely aligned with that piston. I'm going to go to armature and I'm going to click duplicate. And I'm just going to hit escape to approve the operation. Now I'll go back to the armature menu and I'll click switch direction. So I have two bones here facing different directions. I'm just going to select them both and hit S to scale them down. I'm going to need one more bone here for this to work. So with this bottom one selected, I'm going to hit Shift D and S to scale it. It doesn't really matter how far it's going to go. To do these constraints, I'm actually going to go into isolation mode. So I'm going to click View, Local View, and Toggle Local View. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to parent this bone to this bone right here, and I'm going to parent both of these to this bone right here. So with this one selected, I'll hold Shift and select this one, and I'll do Control P, keep offset. And I'll hold Shift again, select both of these, select this bottom one last, do Control P, keep offset. Now if I flip to pose mode, and I'll just turn shapes off again in my viewport display, I have this right now. I have that one going with that part of the arm, and this one going with this part of the arm. So to get this to work without having a dependency, I'm going to take this bone and it's going to constrain to here with a damp track. And this one is actually going to constrain to here with a damp track. That way I'm not getting a full dependency. It's almost just faking the damp track to this bone. It's almost just a location holder at this point. So I'm just going to rename these really quick. This bottom one here I will call Piston underscore bottom 2. This one I'm just going to name Piston underscore bottom holder underscore 1. And this one I'll just name Piston underscore top underscore 2. So with Piston underscore top underscore 2 selected, come right down to the bone constraints. Same thing, I'm going to add a bone constraint, a damp track. I'm going to type rig, piston rig, and I'm just going to type holder because I want that bottom piston bottom holder. And I'll come down to this bone down here, the piston bottom underscore 2. I'm going to go damp track, same thing. I'm going to type in rig. It's going to bring up that bone option. And I'm going to type in piston, and I have piston top 2. So now when I rotate this, I'm getting that nice damp track from both of those without getting a dependency from the joints. I'll do a bit more in-depth talk about dependencies later. Just today I want to get a simple rig working, so if you have any pistons that you want to add, you can play around with this. So I'm going to go to View, and I'm going to exit Local View. I'm going to select on this piece of geometry here. I'll hold Shift and select on the rig. And I'll do Control P, bone. I'll select on this piece right here, and again I'll hold Shift and select on the rig. If you don't get the selection right away, it might even be easier to click on the geometry in the outliner, hold Shift and click on the rig in the outliner, and then click on that bone in the viewport. And I'll do Control P, bone. So now I have that piston working, and I have this piston working. So that's just a quick introduction on how to rig pistons in Blender. It's not too bad once you do a couple of them. I'm going to do a follow-up video to this where I actually review how I would do a shape key with these pistons, just to prevent things like this. So see how that piston's coming back through the bottom there? So I'm going to do another part, and I'm going to show you how to actually avoid that. So the piston can actually extend like that, but then when you collapse it, it's not going to show through the geometry down here. And we're going to do that with a driver and a shape key. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Be sure to download these assets from Gumroad so you can follow along, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.